You can't rewrite the staff or you'll Bill. Nice to see you.
It's nice to have a more time.
It'll be a long wait. Oh yeah.
We can all listen to John and see what's sitting here.
We can help. Although it's on stage.
We got a small one. If you're a U.S. parent of sub doing business in Iran, can a U.S. parent do sub what is that? We're working on it. Hey John, may I say hello? I'm following you everywhere.
I feel like we're talking to each other.
Yes, well,
I'm Stephen Hines, Rockefeller Brothers.
I just want to make sure you say the same thing each time.
Yeah, I'm going to change it.
You know Bill Lewis?
Yes. We go way back.
He and I.
Hi, how are you? Nice to see you again.
Yeah, right, exactly. I was so impressed. The blob is here. It is, I know. So you got to pretend at least put something to it. Or you know, first question. Yeah. You say it in a nice way. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I may do it myself as the first question. Yeah. Yeah. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Fred Kemp, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. Uh, uh, I take enormous pleasure in opening up and welcoming to a lot of our events, to a lot of our work. This is some of the most important work we've done, and so I take particular pleasure being here today to welcome you to today's discussions on the current state of U.S.-Iran relations. Today's half-day symposium was made possible by the joint efforts of the Atlantic Council and the Iran Project. The Atlantic Council began its work on Iran 6 years ago, or its current work. If you go back through our 55-year history, we've touched on it on several occasions. But we began our most current work on Iran 6 years ago when we launched our Iran Task Force, co-chaired by Ambassador Stu Eisenstadt and the then Atlantic Council Board Chairman, then former Senator Chuck Hagel. We're pleased that both are co-chairing the Iran Initiative. Stu Eisenstadt has now been joined by Secretary Hagel now that he's returned to civilian life from the Pentagon. Over the years, we've held more than 70 events, published more than a dozen issue briefs and reports that have examined Iran's regional activities, its nuclear program, domestic politics, and record on human rights. Last year, we focused on the nuclear negotiations which culminated on July 14th with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, a complex agreement that sought to curb Iran's nuclear program in return for sanctions relief. This year, under the acting directorship of Barbara Slavin, our Iran Task Force has become our Iran Initiative, and we've expanded the program to, as I said, a Future of Iran initiative that seeks a deeper understanding of the impact of this agreement and broader U.S. engagement with Iran, and understanding better also what's going on inside of Iran. You never can entirely predict the direction that this historic of an agreement and moment will take. We want to continue to monitor this and to inform the public debate as responsibly and effectively as we can. We're particularly delighted to be hosting this important symposium in the Iran Project under the leadership of former Ambassador Bill Loers. This is our third collaboration with you, sir, and following a conference last December and a luncheon in New York last October with Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif, and it's a pleasure working with you whenever we can. Thank you so much. Today, nearly a year after the agreement was signed and 5 months to the day after it reached full implementation, we are examining whether this deal has worked as anticipated, what the challenges to implementation are, and what the opportunities, if any, have opened up for U.S.-Iranian diplomacy in other spheres. I have a personal interest as well. I hope we'll hear some of that during the course of the day on what this does regionally. We will begin with a panel on sanctions, continue with a look at U.S.-Iran relations, and a panel on the regional landscape, and end with a keynote address. I think we're all very excited about that, with Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes. We hope you will stay for the entire morning and appreciate your continued interest in our Iran work. We're also very happy to have all of our viewers online as well. Usually I'm given a hashtag. What's our hashtag for today? Well, sorry? AC Iran, so hashtag AC Iran. We really look forward also to engaging our online community. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to our co-host, Ambassador Lurs, William Lurs. Apart from an admiral career in the Foreign Service as ambassador to Czechoslovakia and Venezuela, and his current position as director of the Iran Project, Bill is a good friend and a person that I steal ideas from all the time. So Bill, great to collaborate with you again. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Fred, and thanks for this continuing relationship. You have many things you do. We have one thing we do. The Iran Project has been dedicated to finding diplomatic solutions to particularly the big problem, which was nuclear. And this has been going on for 15 years, and a small group of us held together and lived together and worked together. And Stephen Heinz, who is my partner in this venture, and I started this in 2002 with Suzanne DiMaggio, wherever, if Suzanne is here. The first principle for, I guess, me and I think Fred in trying to work together on this issue is to try to depoliticize it. Now that's a big task, to say the least, and we have trying to find ways to include more and more people, thinkers, writers from the other side that has been opposed to it straight through, because now the deal is done and we have a task to do to make it work. And that's a little bit about what this conference is all about. But Fred, I thank you for working with us, using this facility, for the work of Barbara and Michelle, who have been so helpful in making this all happen. And I guess I'd have to say that our funders and partners, Joe Cirincione and the Plowshares Group, many of whom are here, and of course Stephen, who is from Rockefeller Brothers Fund. We are persuaded that there is a possibility over the next year to depoliticize this, depending on what the election looks like. But so we've determined to go out around the country, and the Iran Project has mounted a 20 to 22 city effort to take our group out and try to match as much as we can with opposition speakers and leaders to present to communities, to the newspaper, to the media in these 20 cities a discussion of what this actual agreement means for the United States and U.S. interests, both the possibilities and the risks, not as a sales pitch, but as an effort to bring reality to the discussion and bleed it of its political virility. The answer to the question, can we work with Iran, can the U.S. work with Iran, is first we have to work with Iran on the implementation of this agreement, and that's a requirement. And secondly, we have great opportunities to work with them in other areas, but how do you do that, and will we be able to do it given the political situation in both Iran and the United States? And I hope we'll explore that today, including in the region. My second task was to introduce John Smith, who is the acting director of OFAC. Is there anybody in this room who doesn't know what OFAC is? Is there anybody? It's probably the most powerful small agency in the U.S. government. And it does good things for the U.S. It defends our national security in a peaceful way, an extremely effective way. This is an office of about 200 people, and they have undertaken over the years to carry out the mandates of sanctions legislated by the Congress, strongly supported by the executive branch, And they have brought into line with this effort to restrict the flow of money to not only Iran, but to terrorist organizations and probably 10 or 12 other countries more on which we have legislated sanctions over the last several decades. As you know, or you may not know, that OFAC has its legacy back in the War of 1812. And guess who they were trying to stop the cash flow to in 1812? It's an important organization, and John is now acting head, as you know, because Adam Zubin, his former partner, is now acting undersecretary, and he will not be fully head of the organization until the Congress decides finally to approve the nomination of acting Undersecretary Zubin. Let me say, my experience has been interesting with OFAC. Powerful, important, regulatory, and yet for our experience, they're one of the most accessible organizations in the U.S. government. We've, over these years, had excellent relationship with Adam and with John, and I guess it's important to know that they're always ready to come and talk about the complicated issues, and very complicated issues over which they oversee. John was had spent several years in the office of OFAC, about 7 years, before he did other things. He graduated from University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri, and he grew up about 100 miles from me. I was born in Springfield, Illinois, and he in St. Louis County. And so we're natural Middle Western companions and compatriots. He went to Columbia University, got his law degree, and has been functioning in various roles, particularly in this regulatory area for most of his recent career. John, we've posed a lot of questions to you, and you'll get more. Thank you for coming. It's an honor to us to have you here, and we look forward to hearing your remarks. And after John speaks, the panel will come up, and he will join the panel, and the panel will comment on what he has had to say, and then I guess most of you will get the opportunity to ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, for the very kind introduction. It's actually hard to follow that and hard to live up to it, so I very much appreciate it. And to the Atlantic Council and the Iran Project for hosting today's event. I think it's a very important event for us all to take stock of where we are 1 year after the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or as we call it, the JCPOA, and 5 months from implementation day. It's really a pleasure to be able to take stock of some of the events that have occurred over the past year, particularly in the months since implementation day, and to reflect on the incredibly hard work that we at the Treasury Department, our colleagues at the State Department, and really across the U.S. government, as well as our European Union and other partners around the world, all of the incredibly hard work that we've done and continue to do to implement our commitments under the deal. Of course, hard work is only one part of the equation, and many implementation challenges remain, and I know that we'll be discussing some of those here today. But I can stand here today and say with confidence and without hesitation that we at OFAC and in the U.S. government more broadly have lived up to every commitment that we made 1 year ago. Over the course of the last several months, we at OFAC and with our Treasury State Department colleagues broadly have traveled the world. We've traveled the globe. We've gone to more than 24 countries to spread the word about the sanctions lifting and the sanctions that remain. For my part alone, I've been to Europe 3 times in the last few months, and I have another trip coming up, all on JCPOA-related work. I've met with EU finance ministers, various EU member state government officials, senior and line members of financial institutions, and a host of other private sector business. Iran has kept its end of the deal, and we've upheld ours, and are committed to continuing to do so. After all, by following through on our commitment to provide sanctions relief, we sustain the powerful incentive for Iran to adhere to this deal and provide the same for other malign actors to respond to sanctions by changing their behavior. In every meeting, in every jurisdiction, I reiterate the same vow. OFAC and indeed the entire U.S. government will not stand in the way of permissible business that is within the scope of the JCPOA and the sanctions lifting that we provided. Our message is clear and unwavering. On implementation day, the U.S. government broadly lifted our nuclear-related secondary sanctions, those sanctions that apply to non-U.S. persons for transactions conducted outside the United States, by removing more than 400 individuals and entities from what's known as our SDN list, revoking certain executive orders, and issuing waivers for other sanctions authorities. We've explained in great detail that this sanctions lifting means that non-U.S. persons no longer risk being cut off from the United States or the U.S. financial system for dealing in previously restricted sectors of Iran's economy, or knowingly conducting transactions with or providing goods or services to any of the individuals and entities that we took off our SDN list. Of course, certain U.S. sanctions that were outside the scope of the JCPOA remain in place. These include our sanctions authorities related to Iran's support for terrorism, its ballistic missile program, its human rights abuses, and its destabilizing activities in the region. More than 200 Iranian-related or Iran-related individuals and entities remain on the SDN list for such activities, among others, and secondary sanctions continue to apply to transactions with such designated parties. The other significant area of sanctions that remains is the U.S. primary embargo, which affects U.S. persons or transactions within U.S. jurisdiction. Even after implementation day, U.S. persons continue to be broadly prohibited from engaging in transactions with Iran beyond 3 limited areas of relief agreed to in the JCPOA, in addition to the long-standing authorizations that we had in place already to allow the export of certain goods such as food, medicine, medical products, and agricultural commodities to benefit the people of Iran. At this point, we've explained the sanctions lifting as we've traveled the globe. We've also published extensive guidance and frequently asked questions, or FAQs, on our website, beginning on implementation day and continuing since that time. We've issued nearly 100 pages of guidance so far, including more than 100 FAQs, which we continue to update. In fact, as many of you know, we issued additional FAQs just last week in response to questions that we received from the business community and from other governments. So where does that leave us today? Our message is clear that for non-U.S. persons, there are just 2 primary things to consider as they explore business with Iran. First, is there any secondary sanctions exposure that remains, and what are the potential touch points to U.S. jurisdiction? We also continue to reiterate that in addition to the extensive information that we've put on our website, we have resources available through our hotlines and email inboxes to take additional inquiries. So if people are confused about the rules and need some guidance, reach out to us and we're here to answer if we can. At this point, I think it's useful for me to offer a few perspectives on some of the critiques that I've heard since implementation day in recent weeks, so that you can hear from my perspective about some of those critiques and the OFAC mindset as we try to respond to them. The first critique that I've heard is that our remaining sanctions on Iran are just too complex to understand. I will concede that our sanctions rules, particularly with respect to those affecting U.S. persons in U.S. jurisdictions, are something that are very important for people to understand, and they need to understand the detailed rules. But I disagree that our sanctions rules with respect to non-U.S. persons are too complex to understand. As I've said frequently, there are just 2 simple rules for people to know if you're a non-U.S. person wanting to engage in business with Iran. 1, don't do business with Iran-related persons that remain on our SDN list. That shouldn't be too difficult for much of the world because many of those that remain on our list, such as the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps or the IRGC, also remain designated by the European Union and other partners. So that shouldn't be too difficult to implement those types of restrictions. The second is don't involve a U.S. person, the U.S. financial system, or the U.S. in any way when you as a non-U.S. company want to transact or engage with Iran. That's it. Those are the general rules for non-U.S. persons, non-U.S. companies wanting to deal with Iran. So I disagree that the rules are too complex to understand. The second critique that I've heard floating out there suggests that OFAC hasn't offered sufficient guidance or clarity to allow non-U.S. firms to go back into Iran. As you can probably guess from what I've said already, I disagree. We have offered 100 pages of guidance. We have offered over 100 pages or 100 FAQs. When we get additional questions, when we see that there are general questions that are coming in, we update our FAQs as we did just last week. We haven't stopped in issuing the guidance. We have been traveling the world. We come to meetings like this. We've been to hundreds of them since the JCPOA implementation day occurred, and we're not stopping. But when we probe companies about the supposed lack of guidance, because we're trying to understand what it is that they want to know, we hear their responses boiling down to one of three concerns, and I think it's useful for me to go down to each one of those about what we hear about the concern about lack of guidance or lack of sufficient clarity. The first concern that we hear is that a non-U.S. company wants to use the U.S. financial system or U.S. persons as part of its business. And it wants OFAC, it comes into OFAC and says, please make an exception for us because we have a really important reason that we want to use the U.S. financial system or U.S. persons. The answer is generally going to be no. Our U.S. primary embargo remains. That was part of the JCPOA. That was part of the deal. And so it's not a question of OFAC not providing sufficient guidance or clarity. It's a question of companies not liking the guidance or clarity that we've offered in many cases. Two, there are cases where non-U.S. persons, non-U.S. companies have U.S. person employees. This is very much the case with multinational corporations that have U.S. persons in their ranks. And they want to know, what do they have to do with the U.S. person employees? Can the U.S. person employees be involved, or do they have to be walled off? And the answer is it has been for decades involving non-U.S. companies dealing with countries under U.S. sanctions such as Cuba, Iran, Sudan, Syria, is that the non-U.S. company must wall off its U.S. person employees, even senior executives and compliance officials. This isn't a new concept. Many companies have been doing this successfully for decades. And so this is the answer to some of the concerns that we hear on that front. The third concern about the lack of clarity that companies have said, complained about, may have been a lack of clarity on OFAC's due diligence expectations. What do we expect companies to do going back into Iran? What do we expect European companies, other companies to do when they go back into Iran, particularly with respect to some of the actors that act in a non-transparent way in Iran, such as the IRGC? And here, my response will be twofold. I'll say first, don't hold OFAC responsible for the IRGC's lack of transparency. That's where corporate actors can and should demand accountability and documentation from their potential Iranian partners, including the government of Iran. But second, in terms of due diligence and the level of expectation that we have, I think that's a question that's best posed to the home country's regulator. Many of these entities that remain on our list, as I said, remain on the EU list or other lists. And what I would say to a third country company is go talk to your own regulator about their due diligence expectations, how you can satisfy their home country's desire to make sure that you satisfy the home country's sanctions programs. I can tell you that OFAC will not be playing gotcha for companies that conducted the appropriate due diligence, collected the documentation, but despite their best efforts, unwittingly found themselves dealing with an IRGC front company. That's not the role, and that's not even the legal standard that we have, which is a knowledge standard, knowledge or a reason to know that you were dealing with such an entity. And I should add that we also don't play gotcha in our primary sanctions enforcement either. I'm often asked about the enforcement cases because many people point to some of the big financial institutions that receive penalties and say this is what OFAC is looking to do, is to penalize those that make innocent mistakes. And I'll say to the contrary, over 95% of our enforcement investigations result in what we call a no action or a cautionary letter. That means we go back to the company involved and we say, OFAC is not taking action, or we're going to caution you to be more careful in the future. That is a private letter that goes between OFAC and that company. It's not released publicly. So it's less than 5% of the cases that may result in a public enforcement action. In those cases, the overwhelming number, over 80% of those, involve what we call willful or reckless conduct. The company knew what it was doing, it knew it was engaging with Iran, it knew it was going through the U.S. financial system, and it did so at the peril of U.S. sanctions. And so those are the cases that we tend to take our public enforcement actions. The third and final critique that I've heard that I want to mention quickly is that Iran is not reaping the benefits of the JCPOA because third country companies are afraid of making deals because of U.S. sanctions exposure. And I'll say that's clearly not true. We've seen that Iran has already reaped significant benefits from the deal itself. And some of these statistics that I'm going to recite come from Iran themselves. This is what they're publicizing, and we've seen some of this to be the case. According to the government of Iran and Iran media, since implementation day, Iran's received more than $3.4 billion in foreign investment. It's increased its oil production to 3.5 million barrels per day, and it's exporting more than 2.3 million BPD. It's agreed with 2 foreign aircraft companies to purchase more than 230 civilian passenger aircraft. Its banks have generally reconnected to SWIFT and opened roughly 350 new correspondent accounts, and foreign businesses have signed dozens of deals for future investment in business. Having said that, it's clear that the government of Iran anticipated more. It anticipated near instantaneous recognition by the international financial system, a welcome mat to come back into Iran, underestimating the changes that Iran itself would need to make, including updating its financial and business systems to meet Western standards. I will acknowledge that some non-U.S. companies have indicated they don't want to take on any Iran business, despite the sanctions lifting, for a variety of reasons, including perceived sanctions risks. These companies recognize that there are compliance costs in dealing with jurisdictions that may be assessed as higher risks, whether because of sanctions, instability, or a lack of controls or transparencies. And these companies have demonstrated and determined that the benefits of such trade may not for themselves at this point in time outweigh the risks. Indeed, many non-U.S. companies have clarified to us, though, that their sanctions concerns, what they're calling sanctions concerns, are really boiled down to concern over Iran's AML CFT regime, its lack of transparency in the corporate and financial sector, and its status on the FATF blacklist. All of these are real concerns and will be best addressed by Iran making strides to make its investment climate more in line with Western standards. And we believe it's critical that businesses not simply use U.S. sanctions as shorthand for these types of concerns, because we do not want to diminish the pressure on the government of Iran to undertake the long overdue and necessary changes it must make to its financial system to truly re-enter the world's economy. Iran needs to continue to receive the message that it must modernize its economy, it must update its technology and business standards, increase transparency, and avoid provocative actions that diminish the confidence of Western business and investors. In the meantime, OFAC will continue to be here to be available to answer questions relating to U.S. sanctions, and the U.S. government will continue to live up to our commitments that we made before implementation day with the deal and that we ratified with implementation day. So we're just about a year down in the life of the deal and 5 months to the day, as we've heard, from implementation day. And I think it's time now that I end my presentation and that we can start with some questions from all of you. So with that, I'll thank you for coming today.
the Energy Economics and Security Program at the Center for New American Security. Thanks for, may I offer my thanks as well to the Atlantic Council and to the Iran Project, excuse me, for hosting us here. So now we have an opportunity to continue the conversation with John, and also joining me, sorry, one second, on the panel this morning that will deal with sanctions is Teresa Archer-Pradas, the Deputy Head of Sanctions Division at the European External Action Service, and George Kleinfeld, a partner at Clifford Chance. Sorry, one second. Excuse me. So we have a portion of time for this panel. I'll begin by asking a few questions between the group of us and then open up to the audience for some of your own questions. And so against the backdrop, thank you for framing that for us, John. You have acknowledged that unlike what some feared and others have expected, there hasn't been this financial windfall to Iran that has been promised, certainly, by a number of Iranian politicians and expected elsewhere. And Iranian hardliners have harshly criticized the United States using language such as the United States and its P5+1 partners didn't negotiate in good faith, haven't been upholding their part of the bargain. But as you also noted, nevertheless, there have been correspondent banking relationships reinstituted, some major deals that have come into place. Crude trading, petroleum crude trading, has increased much faster, in fact, than many analysts had expected. So you implied, I think, that sanctions aren't actually responsible for the slower economic recovery in Iran than many people expected. Is that what you meant? And also, can I just add here, for those who, well, actually start there, and then I'll come back to that.
So what I would say is I think sanctions are maybe a piece of a business calculation. I think when you look at if you're a big bank or if you're a company, you're going to look at the risks of going back into Iran, and you're going to look at your exposure to any U.S. or European or other sanctions. That's going to be a factor. But you're also going to look to what you can be assured about when you deal with an Iranian company. Do you know who you're dealing with? Do you know who the parent of that company is? Are you going to get paid for it? Are they living up to international standards in terms of transparency and global accountability? What does it mean if you're one of two countries on the FATF blacklist? What does that mean for me as a company? So I would say that sanctions are a piece of it, and we're doing our part to get out around the world to explain what the sanctions rules are. So that's certainly a factor, but I think that is just one of many factors that businesses are dealing with. And I don't think it's the overriding factor for most of them, at least when they talk to us.
So who else has a role for explaining that there are these other factors besides sanctions? Because certainly if you take a survey of broad international press, the overwhelming impression, which as you suggest may be ill-informed, is that in fact US sanctions are the primary impediment for Iranian economic recovery.
Well, I think when you say who else has the role, I think we've been trying to take our part on the role in terms of going around the world. I think we've been working very closely with our EU partners and EU member states and other governments. When I've talked about the EU because we're here on a panel with the US and EU, but we've gone around the world. We've gone to the Gulf, we've gone to Asia. We've talked to those governments because governments that want their companies to go back into Iran have a vested interest. And so we are working with those governments to be partners to make sure that we can answer all of the questions. But I think it's not just a government issue. I think it's also going to be an Iranian issue. The government of Iran is going to need to make some of the tough choices about increasing the transparency in its sectors and limiting the role of the IRGC in the economy. Because the more the IRGC is out there spreading through the economy, the more that businesses will be afraid that, do we know who we're dealing with? Right. And then I think the last part comes to the international standards. Those they'll work with the FATF and other organizations to make sure that they uphold international standards that the rest of us hold basic.
Let me turn the question, the same version of this, to you, Teresa. So in the EU, what role have you been playing, or is the EU playing to clarify for EU companies, EU nationals, including multinationals, though European-based, about the rules for Iran? And I'll just add to this. a number of European companies have said quite publicly that they see fault and difficulty with US sanctions. So what position does that put you in clarifying for your companies exactly what business is now allowed?
I think it's clear that we also have a role to play. We have been involved in the negotiations not only through the 3 member states of the European Union, UK, France, and Germany, but also the High Representative of the European Union was leading and coordinating the negotiations. So we also have a role to play now in the implementation of the GCPOA and in the lifting of sanctions, because EU sanctions were also lifted on implementation day on 60th of January when, after the International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed that Iran fulfilled its nuclear-related commitments. So of course there's also, first of all, there's also all the old EU sanctions that were lifted and that have allowed new areas of business with Iran on energy, transport, finance, and banking issues. So there's the EU dimension of the deal that was important. And we also play a role in the implementation of the GCPOA, and the High Representative Federica Mogherini is coordinating the joint commission responsible for overseeing the implementation of the deal. In terms of what we did, in addition to the lifting of sanctions, we also published a EU information note providing extensive information and guidance to EU economic operators. Of course, it only concerns the EU sanctions. It's not for us to explain how US sanctions are to be interpreted. So I think this is where we play a different role. So for us, it's to explain EU sanctions, and for the US, we would expect US to explain US sanctions as they've been doing. And I think a lot has been done. We have also engaged intensively with our business community, also not only at European level, but at the member states level, because they are in close contact with their own business community. And we also have been in close cooperation with US, and we think a lot has been done. The fact that the guidance was updated 1 week ago really shows that there's a continuing engagement and commitment towards the GCPOA, and that the guidance is a living document, not only the EU guidance, but US guidance, and this provides further assurances to the international community and to the business community that if there are questions, they will be addressed.
Good, I certainly hope so. But so George, taking up on this point of the guidance that exists, in your position advising US companies and foreign companies who are contemplating new business with Iran, how, in your experience, do these companies look at the guidance that's been provided? Is it adequate? Are there still questions that are left unanswered? And can you also just quickly sketch out, besides what John mentioned at the beginning about some of the new business that is occurring, what are we seeing? What kinds of business? What is working?
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin as someone who is advising clients in this area and working with OFAC by noting that what John said in his opening remarks is it's just dead on accurate. There was no spin there. It really is the case that the U.S. is living up to all of its commitments and putting out huge amount of very valuable guidance to the community. And on the other hand, as John said, these sanctions, although they can be simplified according to the 2 basic fundamental rules, nevertheless are very complicated. But there are people like me out there who are happy to plume the depths of the complexity to address issues from clients. So complexity alone isn't an impediment to business. In terms of what's going on in the business community, Liz, you've noted the types of deals that are being done. A lot of commodities deals, basically deals that don't involve long-term credit risk, cash and carry type deals. Deals where the Iranian counterparty is the National Iranian Oil Company or some other state-owned enterprise where the diligence is pretty easy because you know the owner is the government and not some shadowy third party. On the other hand, if we're talking about major investment products, somebody needing to put billions of dollars into the ground in Iran, the only types of deals of that caliber that I think are likely to go forward over the near term are deals that are fully backed by export credit agencies of the EU member governments or other credit-worthy non-US governments, where the governments are taking the credit risk. And we are seeing some deals of that kind under development. Everyone in the room who's following the press coverage knows that a big impediment to resumption of business with Iran is the absence of support for such business by the world's leading non-US financial institutions, particularly those based in Europe. And John sort of took you through the reasons why there is tremendous reluctance among those financial institutions, and it's not because OFAC is acting unreasonably or refusing to provide necessary guidance. It's because of a host of risks and reasons, but obviously that's a big bottleneck. What I'd like to comment on very briefly is what I see as a lesser of the evil situation for the United States in this current position of instability. The logic of the deal is that Iran wasn't willing to offer the United States anything that would have persuaded the United States to remove the primary sanctions. And in fact, Iran perhaps wasn't interested in economic engagement with the United States and preferred to engage with the rest of the world. Iran didn't appreciate, and perhaps no one really appreciated, that the deal that was struck, because it foreclosed access to the US financial system and the involvement of US persons in non-US dealings with Iran, would make it very difficult for global business with Iran to resume until such point in time as the mechanics of global finance and trade were readjusted to completely exclude the US financial system from that activity. And over time, ultimately, that's the solution. But that's a terrible solution for the United States, because the success of our sanctions depends on the centrality of the US financial system and the US economy, so that by imposing sanctions that deny access, we can compel a change in conduct. On the other hand, if we want to steer in a different direction, it means we have to offer concessions unilaterally to Iran by making exceptions to the ironclad prohibition on involvement of the US financial system and US persons in Iran-related deals. And it is contrary to all precepts of US foreign policy to offer unilateral concessions in return for nothing, except what we would get in return would be preserving the centrality of the US financial system. So those are the lesser of the evils, even assuming that the deal survives the current instability and reaches a point of maturity where the rest of the world has adjusted and created a non-US financial system alternative not only to business with Iran, but with Russia and other countries that are the object of either selective or comprehensive sanctions.
Thank you. You mentioned something that I thought was quite interesting about the kind of deals that you expect will be successful going forward in the near future, specifically those that have public financing or government endorsement, which as a proxy for government endorsement. Taking as an example the Boeing deal reported on in the last couple of days, John, you happen to be one of perhaps the foremost expert on sanctions law issues, but is it possible that that deal could have any kind of government backing in any fashion as they figure out the financing for it?
So I won't talk about any particular deal.
Right.
As OFAC, I have to always not talk about any
commercial aircraft
particular
deal.
companies. Right. I think that U.S. Companies that are authorized to engage in trade with Iran, whether it would be U.S. companies that fit within one of our authorizations or non-U.S. companies, can get financing through a variety of sources. Some of them have been, as we've talked about, government sources. We are seeing a reluctance of larger banks around the world to dive in. That's actually not surprising to me. I hadn't expected that. The world's biggest banks need a much bigger deal, have bigger profit margins, and we always expected that it was going to be the intermediate, medium to smaller financial institutions that would dip their toe in the water first. And I think it is possible for the authorized deals to get financing, whether from governments or whether from those financial institutions that are willing to take the risk.
Even for U.S. deals?
For U.S. deals that are authorized, when we authorize, if it is authorized, and again, not talking about any particular deal, if it is authorized, the financing is generally something that we call incident to the authorization, and so they're allowed to use they're allowed to use the financing mechanisms that would be contained within an authorization. Again, I'm getting very close to talking about a specific deal.
Very technical,
so
very technical.
I'm going to
All right.
move away from it.
Okay, moving on. I want to think about the broader issues of perceptions around this deal. So this is taking again as an example this particular deal. We could also compare it to the Airbus announced deal, slightly larger. These are multi-billion-dollar, multi-year deals. It's not necessarily the kind of trade finance or trading of commodities or others that would, where the entire transaction would close in a relatively short period of time. So, Teresa, let me start with you. In Europe, how are people perceiving this Boeing deal, as well as the Airbus one? Is this a vote of confidence that, in fact, the deal is working, that commerce can occur? It may be slow-moving at first, but larger, multi-year, multi-billion-dollar deals are forthcoming.
I will not speak about the Boeing deal.
Okay.
But yes, the Airbus deal, there's the clear perception that bigger and big deals will involve big financial institutions, because this is something that is lacking. And it would be extremely important to give this boost of confidence to the deal and to the implementation and to the Iranian people that a major deal goes through and has and involves all the financial elements and institutions that would ensure that it materializes.
Okay, and George, moving to you too. I mean, as you're looking forward over, say, the next 6 months or a year, you've sketched out what it, in general terms, what increasing business could look like. What will be the trajectory in your view? How would you sketch it out in a little more detail? And what will the specific or most primary impediments be?
If you're a European or an Asian business person, you're concerned about a host of risks when you're looking at the Iranian market. And the biggest uncertainty is the snapback risk. The JCPOA has within it a specific protocol for the reimposition of the sanctions that were removed, which could occur if Iran decides no longer to comply with its obligations, or if, due to a change in the administration here in the United States, the U.S. decides to go down its own different path. And these are uncontrollable risks that are completely impossible to hedge from a business perspective. Contributing to this uncertainty, and I think not widely appreciated, is the fundamental distinction between the U.S. secondary sanctions and the U.S. primary sanctions. So the U.S. primary sanctions are effectively permanent over the short to medium term. They're not going to change. It's the U.S. secondary sanctions that might snap back, along with the European equivalent. And the U.S. secondary sanctions effectively are a secondary boycott. Traditionally, the U.S. has opposed secondary boycotts, and in fact, it's illegal for U.S. persons to participate in the Arab League secondary boycott of Israel. And historically, the Europeans have also been very hostile to secondary boycotts, including those imposed historically by the United States in an effort to chill certain types of European business with Cuba or chill European participation in a Soviet pipeline project, et cetera, et cetera. Since 2010, the US and the Europeans have worked together with great success to coordinate their Iran sanctions policy. So there was an acceptance in Europe of very extreme US secondary sanctions that basically involved the US government telling companies in Europe that they can't do certain kinds of business with Iran, even if that business has nothing to do with the United States. So the big mystery in the future is, what if it's the US that decides to reimpose secondary sanctions, whereas the Europeans are pretty much happy with Iranian compliance and proud of their diplomatic achievement as Europeans in forging this JCPOA, and don't take kindly to the idea that US government officials will come to Germany and England and France and tell companies in Europe what they can and cannot do in respect of their business that has nothing to do with the United States. I personally would find it gratifying if the Europeans and the European authorities would shed some light on how they would deal with that hypothetical scenario, because I think it would contribute to some public education here in Washington. There's this notion that the secondary sanctions are a legal instrument just like every other legal instrument that can be used at the discretion of the United States regardless of how the rest of the world feels about them. And historically, that's not a correct presumption. In the last few years, it's worked due to a confluence of interests. I'm not sure that's how it will work in the future.
So this is a great jumping off point for a question I wanted to ask. There's a number of ambiguities in looking forward in the future that may influence the way in which the transatlantic partners work together on sanctions in the Iran case. Of course, there's a Brexit vote coming up in the not distant future, a US presidential election, elections elsewhere in Europe and France, for example. Not asking our government representatives to speculate, can I ask you, however, to talk about what the EU and what the US can do to try and look forward, anticipating some change that I have just mentioned, how to put in place some safeguards for ensuring that the deal can proceed, that implementation can proceed as has been intended by the current political leaders who put this deal in place.
I could start and just say that I think what we've been doing over the past months, but even really the past year, is building that building that foundation between the United States and Europe, and Europe being not only the member states, but the European Union as an institution. I've been at OFAC for 9 years, and I've seen a sea change in the way that we implement sanctions. At the beginning, we would often historically be implementing our sanctions, and we'd notify partner governments that we were moving forward. Over the past many years, we've worked hand in glove with the European Union and member states in building sanctions regimes, not just for Iran, but for Russia, Ukraine, and even a whole host of other conflict areas where we talk together, we work together before we implement those sanctions. So I think the work that we've done constructively over many years doesn't go away overnight. It doesn't go away because of any election, and I think that it will be our fundamental goal as I'm a civil servant. It will be my continued operation. It'll be my standard operating procedure to work with my European partners and other partners around the world in building sanctions or reducing sanctions, because we know that when sanctions are multilateral, they have a greater impact, and when we work together to ease, that also has a greater impact. So I fully expect that to continue no matter what changes happen in any election in any country.
No, I would agree with John and I think it's quite unprecedented, the fact that it's for the first time we are lifting sanctions together in such big scale, because the agreement was negotiated together. So both the annexes that have all the sanctions that were lifted were negotiated together. We are now working on the implementation of this lifting together. So it's extremely important, and we are. And it's very difficult to speculate what will happen if. I would leave that to those that need to invest and to make decisions, not for So it's very important. And on snapback, I think it's a little bit different than, for example, what would happen in the case of elections or if someone walks off the deal, because in case of snapback, we are talking about a violation of the agreement by Iran. So where and it's a process. It's not something that will happen overnight. It's something that will be discussed, that will be addressed, hopefully. So it's not something that we can speculate at this stage, and something that will not happen overnight.
Okay, I want to ask one more question to you, John, and then I'll open it up for questions from the audience. You can prepare your thoughts. So I have a question for you on licensing. So you have offered assurances that OFAC will not stand in the way of permitted business. Nevertheless, we certainly hear from the private sector that there's a lot of frustration about a lack of sufficient guidance, that there are inquiries that they make, formal inquiries that they make in the form of specific license requests or requests for guidance that take a long time to be answered. There's definitely, I mean, certainly we can all understand that there's lots of questions and there's only so many of you, but can you help us understand with some data or empirical information what that looks like, what the licensing burden or request looks like? How many are you getting? How many people are working on them? How fast can you work through them? Is it, in fact, are we on an upswing or a downswing?
So what I can say is we're working flat out on this. We are stretched to the limit, and people ask me about how much we can do for licensing, and I can tell you that we have beefed up our licensing division in substantial ways. We've added more licensing officers. We've just created a new licensing chief to help get licenses out faster. We're doing what we can within the confines of a small government agency that is restricted in our resources. And so we're trying to make sure that we can do the most we can. With licenses in terms of a time frame, I can't give a good answer for that for the following reason. We get some urgent licenses that are national security, foreign policy priorities, sometimes with a day's notice or a couple days' notice that there is something major that has to occur and we have to issue this license. And so there are licenses that are issued within a matter of a day or a couple days because they are urgent national security, foreign policy priorities. I wish that were not the case. I wish that life were more orderly and we could always have a licensing process that could be predictable. Most licenses can take longer, and I expect that they will take longer at the beginning, and they can stretch into the weeks and into the months, and for that, I do apologize. But this is the process, and this is the reason at the beginning, particularly, that this occurs. Many of the license applications that come in, and you have to understand, when you're first talking about a license application, you're talking about something that is not already authorized pursuant to the deal. It is something, or pursuant to US law, it is something that you want us to make an exception to the current set of rules for. And so with the Iran program, and with the deal still being relatively fresh, 5 months since implementation day, we got hundreds, if not into the thousands by this point, of license applications, many of which were seeking to do something new or unique because we were at a turning point in our relationship with Iran. Many or most of those that require some new thought in terms of national security, foreign policy priorities will be something that then we would send over to the State Department for foreign policy guidance. And it is then up to our State Department to evaluate and assess whether the license application itself would meet the foreign policy priorities of the US government. And so, especially at the beginning, when you're looking at a new type of license, those are difficult questions. They often involve more than one agency of the US government. They may involve the Commerce Department. They may involve other parts of the US government. And so at the beginning, as we struggle to set up the certain policy with an aspect or a category of license applications, that can take longer. What I can tell you is my experience over 9 years is once you answer the first batch of those questions, then the guidance is there and the license applications that can come in are treated pursuant to those standards.
So how long does it...
The last thing I wanted to say
Yep.
is generally, even though I said there are some urgent ones that come in that we have to treat that day, most license applications are treated on a first in, first out basis. So we process according to the license application when it comes in, and we go through that process. We often hear European or third country companies saying if they have to come in for a license because of some US connection, they often wonder, are we put to the bottom of the pile? And the answer is no. Generally, it's a first in, first out per category of license applications. You were saying, how long does it take?
To do a first round, is that a 6-month period, an 18-month period?
It'll be different depending on there are some that we've already resolved. There are some licenses that have already gone out that we needed foreign policy guidance for. We got the foreign policy, we went forward. There are some that we decided as OFAC we didn't need foreign policy guidance.
Right.
We could make the decision. Those went forward. And there are some that are months and they're still waiting. And I
Right.
want to be as transparent as possible. There are some that are months and they're still waiting. Those are the tougher calls, often that involve broader foreign policy issues or that involve complex legal issues. Some of the issues that we're confronting are there's a UN Security Council regime that's set up, there's a procurement channel that's set up as part of that, and some of the license applications that we get may implicate some of the UN standards. So we not only have to make the decision as the US government, but we also have to be able to consult foreign partners to say, this is the way we're going to interpret it. Is this the way you as the E3, you as the EU are also going to interpret this to make sure that we're on the same page?
Okay, so we'll move now to some questions from the audience. In the back, or mid back, yeah, you holding your hand up? A lady standing here, yes, your brown hair, can you stand up? Yes, you, yes. There's a microphone coming to you. Thank you.
Hi, it's Emily Meredith from Energy Intelligence, and I have a question that sort of follows on Liz's, and that's...
Can you speak up a little?
Yep, sorry, and that's just, is OFAC right now in the business of issuing letters of comfort or advisory opinions, or are we on, things that are already allowed, not things that still need to be licensed?
And the answer is, I'm going to say a yes and no and explain. We don't issue, as a rule, to U.S. companies who have dealt with us for years, we don't issue a license or a comfort letter or any kind of letter for something that we've already authorized. Because if we did that, we would never issue licenses. We'd just be issuing comfort letters for things that we've already authorized. We're getting a lot of those questions from non-US companies now saying, we know it's within the scope of the sanctions lifting that you've allowed under secondary sanctions, but will you give us a letter that says that? And the answer is no. We're going to treat non-US companies the same way we treat US companies if we've authorized them already under the scope of either the sanctions lifting or under the scope of US sanctions, then we don't do a separate letter. Now, I will tell you that there are things that are called comfort letters that we issued over the course of the deal where there were things that were the governments involved in the deal wanted to occur, and it was unclear whether what would occur was authorized by US sanctions. And so in those cases, what we said is you can do this pursuant to the JCPOA. That was something that is, if you think of those letters as being in the handfuls where we basically are explaining the architecture of the deal and why something that the P5+1, E3+3, and the European Union decided was necessary as part of the deal. So the answer is no, we don't do comfort letters or letters as a matter of course. Now, you asked for advisory opinions. We do request for interpretive guidance if there is some question that is really, you believe is not answered by our sanctions rules, then that is a typical, you can either, often we'll see an application for license or a request for interpretive guidance, where a company comes in and says, we think this may be authorized, but we want to ask for a license if it's not. And so we do get those types of applications today.
Over here, the gentleman, glasses, holding your hand up. Yep. Yes, you, sir. Your name and affiliation, please.
Behrouz Hadavi. I have a question regarding restrictions that are imposed at the state level or by the courts. Do you have authority over those as well, or it's kind of a secondary foreign policy type action?
Well, maybe we'll give you a break for just a second. George, do you want to offer anything on this first?
Sure. Just for the benefit of the audience, many states prohibit their state pension funds from investing in non-Iranian companies that engage in certain kinds of Iranian business. And the JCPOA doesn't require the federal government of the United States to arrange for the termination of those state-level prohibitions. I think there's an effort to communicate with the states that those prohibitions are anachronistic in a post-JCPOA world, but it's not a violation, to my knowledge, of the JCPOA if the states decide to continue not to permit their pension funds to invest in certain securities issued by companies that do certain kinds of business with Iran. In terms of the courts, I think the reference is to litigation by plaintiffs' lawyers on behalf of the families of persons who have died in circumstances that are, according to the litigation, attributable to the government of Iran, where the government of Iran didn't show up in court to defend itself, and the courts therefore awarded huge judgments. And to enforce these judgments, the claimants are pursuing Iranian government assets held in the United States. And the JCPOA doesn't have any impact on that situation. I understand that Iran is extremely unhappy with the recent legislative developments that enhance the ability of plaintiffs' lawyers to claim against Iranian assets, and is planning to pursue an action against the United States at the International Court in The Hague. But again, that's from a U.S. perspective, that's not a JCPOA violation by the United States.
Okay. In the interest of time, what I'll do now is take about 3 or 4 questions and then ask for the panel to give their responses. So in the yellow right here. Yep.
Thank you. My name is Amal Mudallali. I'm with the Wilson Center. My question is about what Mr. Smith talked about the IRGC, and it seems that you are differentiating between the Iranian government and its military wing, the IRGC. Could you please tell us how are you going to enforce that? The burden is on the companies to decide what is an IRGC company, because the IRGC has proliferation in all aspects of the Iranian economy. Who's going to decide this is a company that's supported by the IRGC or not? The American government or the companies have to do their own work? Thank you.
Thank you. All the way in the back, and I think the last row in black. Yes.
Hi, thanks. I'm Suzanne DiMaggio from New America. My question is for Mr. Smith, and it relates to the Specially Designated Nationals list, the SDN list. I think it's fair to say that the unsavories on that list, who they are and what they do and where their tentacles go, is quite murky. I think there's a similar issue that we've encountered in Myanmar, too. They have an SDN list. There, we call them cronies, and they have their fingers in every pie. So I would imagine that if I was an investor looking to go into Iran, that would really turn me off, that murkiness. So as OFAC, what do you recognize the murkiness that entails? And do you work with potential investors to help them get a lay of the land? And if you went into Iran and worked with the company, later on it could be revealed that one of these individuals was in some way directly or indirectly involved in that company. Is there some flexibility in how you deal with that? Thank you.
Okay, we'll take 2 more very quickly. Barbara, and then in the front.
Thanks. Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council. Excellent discussion. 2 questions. What are you doing to facilitate academic exchanges between the U.S. and Iran? Are you doing anything to reduce the regulatory burden there of having to get OFAC licenses for professors and students to talk to each other? And can Boeing use a U.S. bank if it gets approval from you guys
Thank you.
to sell
And
planes? Thank you.
Here we are.
Stephen Heinz, Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Thank you all very much. Terrific and illuminating conversation. My question is about the Financial Activity Task Force, the FATF. As you've noted, John, North Korea and Iran are the only two countries listed on the so-called blacklist. There is an upcoming meeting of the task force, I think, in the next few weeks. Is the U.S. prepared to support removing Iran from the blacklist at this point? And if not, say a little bit more about what Iran would have to do in order to get off the list. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for your excellent questions. John, I'm going to give you the floor to do cleanup here, and I'm afraid our time is tight, so be efficient.
I'm going to go fast, faster than I have so far, and I apologize if I haven't done it fast enough before. When you talk about the IRGC and who enforces and how to where the burden is on that, who decides whether it's the IRGC? And the answer is that in the first instance, it's the company. The company does the due diligence to understand who it is dealing with. And I'm going to take it out of the sanctions landscape. And I would say for anybody who wants to deal with any other company around the world, you're going to do your due diligence to make sure that you know your customer, you know your client, you know who that company is. And I think in much the same way, I would expect you to do it here. We do not aim to play gotcha with this. And as I said in my opening remarks, our standard is a knowledge standard in the secondary sanctions context, meaning that you should have known, that you knew or should have known, that you, but if you collect the documents, if you do your due diligence and you had no way of knowing, we do not expect you to know the unknowable. That is going to be the answer you're going to hear from OFAC, and people have been hearing it since implementation day. I think that gets a little bit to the second question on the SDN list, unsavories and the murkiness there. I think this how we try to deal with that at OFAC is when we know that there's clearly somebody that is linked to a crony or linked to another company, you'll see us update our list, as we recently did in Burma, to add additional companies linked to cronies. That's one of the ways that we try to do it. But the answer is the same, that we expect companies to do their due diligence, to do their homework, and know who they're dealing with. You don't have to take my word for it that OFAC is not looking to penalize innocent mistakes, because every one of our penalties, every one of our settlements is on our website. We are as transparent as can be. We don't do side cover deals where something is not transparent. So if you want to see our enforcement cases, go on our website and look at the type of activities that we're talking about. And those banks and other companies that received sizable penalties from OFAC, you'll see the knowledge and the awareness and the recklessness that occurred in virtually all of those cases. And so I think that can give you some assurance there. So I do think that we are flexible. In terms of what we're doing to facilitate academic exchanges between the US and Iran, I think it continues to be a discussion between OFAC and the State Department to make sure that we do all we can between the United States and the Iranian people to support the proper exchanges, whether they be academic or elsewhere. And we continue to have ongoing discussions. I don't want to talk about any particular area, but that continues, that has been a focus of our policy. It is the reason that we have long allowed food, medicine, medical products, and even internet personal communication devices to go to the people of Iran because of those types of policies, and we continue those discussions. You ask about a particular company and whether they'd be allowed to use a U.S. bank. I won't talk about a particular company, but what I can say is generally when we authorize a U.S. company to engage in a transaction, the financing or the banking for that can be an authorized part of the transaction. And you can look at how, I think the best model for this may be what's occurred in the exports of food and medicine and how the banking transactions work there. And I would continue to point to that as a model of what we've continued to allow through our programs. And on the FATF question, I don't want to talk about what we're prepared to do in the future, and I can be very honest about this and say, happily, the FATF work is not in my portfolio. It's another part of our overall TFI portfolio. But what I can say is that the U.S., our European partners, and the other members of the FATF have been engaging in good faith with Iran in this process, and I expect that that will continue in the future, and I think it will take some work on the government of Iran's part to meet the necessary next steps that can happen.
Thank you, John. And can I ask all of you to join me in thanking the panel for their remarks with a round of applause? Here.
Since I drank from the bottle,
Oh, do.